Hi and welcome to my channel. I'm Marco on RC 74. In today's episode I'm gonna talk about a very important step on my 2-meter carbon cup from Horizon Hobby. The target of this build is to rebuild the custom bush plane built by Mike Patey. The last build steps were all about the shaping of the double wishbones, installation of the double wishbones, and first time putting on the wheels just to check if everything works as it should. But before we start with all the details, we just should have a look at the look of the landing gear. I think it looks really amazing and I'm really happy with the results so far. There are some little details I still have to work on. So let's jump right into the build steps and have a closer look what I've done. To get a better impression about the double wishbone design, I just remove one of the wheels. So like this we have a better look at the double wishbone and it's easier to explain all the details what happened. In the last two videos you can see all the build up of the double wishbones. In this video it's all just about detail shaping to make it possible to install the double wishbones on the mount and install the wheel knuckles on the double wishbones. First of all, I had to mask and draw the cutouts for the mounts on the fuselage and cut them out with my Dremel tool and the cutting disc just to get the perfect shape and the wishbone fit between the two mounts. To get a better fit, I took a file and shaped all the corners and edges of the cutouts just to make it look a little nicer and make it also possible to give the double wishbone the space it needs to move on the full travel range the suspension has. Then I did a first movement check if everything fits on the fuselage side, just to make sure that nothing scratches or the double wishbone stuck on the mount, but it looked pretty good. To avoid any noises when the suspension is moving, I added O-rings between the mounts and the wishbones just to avoid any noises and also scratching of the wishbones on the carbon of the mounts. And like this it's really noiseless and with zero play between the wishbones and the mounts. Then I had to sand down the width of the knuckle ends of the double wishbones to the exact same width on each wishbone, just to make sure that I have the same distance and perfectly centered knuckle cut out on each wishbone to make the knuckle sit perfectly centered. The brass tubes which are installed in the wishbones to install all the hardened steel rods I used are around 2.18 millimeters inner diameter. So I tried to drill out the diameter to 2.2 millimeters so I can fit the 2.2 millimeter rod to have absolutely zero play. Unfortunately on the fuselage side that didn't work out, so I had to stay on the 2.1 millimeter rods. Like this there's a tiny bit of play, you almost cannot feel it, it's a few hundredths of a millimeter, but to even eliminate this bit of play I will use some very thick RC car differential oil which removes the whole play. On the knuckle side the drilling went absolutely perfect to 2.2 millimeters, so I was able to install the 2.2 millimeter rods, and like this there is absolutely zero play on the knuckle side, which is also the more important side because there's a short length of the rods and of the tubes, and if you have any play the wheels can move around pretty much, and like this it's really zero play, so I can give some force onto the knuckle but it doesn't move at all. To get the final shape on the knuckle side I also had to mask and draw the design of the cutouts for the knuckles. Also used my Dremel tool and sanded out the raw shape For the final shape, I used a 10mm aluminum rod with some sandpaper wrapped around to sand it to the pretty nice shape you can see on the Wishbone now. So I think the result looks pretty good. There are a little bit of corrections I'm going to do later. To get enough space for the knuckles, for the whole movement of the double Wishbone, I had to sand angles into the cutouts just to get enough space for the whole travel range the double Wishbones have. Had to do the same shape on the lower and the upper Wishbone. Then it was time to do the final shaping and soldering on the knuckles. So first of all, I had to reduce the 3mm tubes to the exact same length so they fit perfectly, also with zero play into the space. Same for both sides and lower and upper Wishbone. And after this, I had to solder all the tubes together. Luckily, it was possible to solder all the solder connections on the inside of the knuckle. So from the outside, the knuckle looks super clean, no solders visible from the outside. The only step I'm gonna do later is to close the top and bottom of the 10mm tube just to make the knuckle look even a little nicer. I think I'm gonna do this with a small carbon cap to make the finish look a bit cleaner. To reduce the brass tubes to the right shape, I used my drill and put the sandpaper underneath it, and like this I also reached the perfect flat end of the brass tubes. Same for the 3mm tubes and also for the 10mm tubes, just to get the result which looks as clean as possible. Then I had to cut down the 2.2mm rods to the exact right length. For this it's very important if you use hardened steel rods, which were the only kind of steel which is exactly in this diameter. Regular steel I only found in 2.0 or 2.5 millimeters, but not 2.1 or 2.2. So I had to take hardened steel, and to cut hardened steel, that's pretty tricky. So it's very important to use diamond cutting disc. With this diamond cutting disc, that was an absolute dream to cut these hardened steel rods. It was super easy. The cutting disc and the rods didn't even get hot, and the result looks pretty nice. I shortened them a little shorter than the tubes in the Wishbone. The reason for this is that I will close up the gap you can see here later with some epoxy or Loctite or something, just to keep the rods in the position in the tubes. Then it was time to cut and shape the wheel axles. These are also 4mm brass tubes. They look pretty weak, and they are actually pretty weak. The solution for this, I will solder them into the knuckles, and to reinforce the rods I will glue in 3mm carbon tubes with a 24-hour epoxy. They fit absolutely perfect into the tubes. Like this, the wheel axles will be strong enough. They are now a bit too long for the rims, so I will cut them down to the right length later during the build, when I'm sure what the travel is, where the wheel exactly sits on the axle. And perhaps I also have to shape the corners of the double Wishbones to make sure the tires won't touch the double Wishbones, especially on the upper Wishbone. Stock outer diameter of the brass tubes was a bit too big for the ball bearings, so there was no chance to put in the axles like this. So I had to install them into my drill and sand down the diameter a little bit, and now they fit absolutely perfect into the wheels with absolutely zero play. I also had to do a little mod on the 3D printed rims. The inner diameter of the rims has the same diameter like the ball bearings. So you have friction of the tube not only on the ball bearings but also on the 3D printed part. So that avoids to make it possible for the wheels to spin absolutely free. I decided to drill out from 4.0 to 4.5 millimeter. So I took the whole rims apart and drilled each side of the rim to 4.5 millimeters. And after this, the wheels really spin absolutely free. No more friction on the 3D printed part. And as you can see, the ball bearings can do their job absolutely perfect. Then I put it on the wheels on the landing gear just to check if the whole travel of the landing gear works with no friction. And as already mentioned, the upper wishbone is pretty close to the tire, and perhaps I will sand down a little bit the edges of the wishbones to avoid any friction between the wishbone and the tire. So these are the steps so far I did on the landing gear. I couldn't be happier with the result so far. There are still some detail works on the landing gear to do, some shaping of the double wishbones, cutting the rods on the fuselage end to the right length, soldering the wheel axle, installing the carbon tubes, all that stuff. Next video will be about the mount for the shock absorbers, which I'm gonna install. There are 2 shock absorbers on each side, and I have to install a shock absorber mount on the fuselage. The target is to build a mount which goes through the whole fuselage to make it really strong. And on the tail, there will be some first steps on the build of the suspension of the tail wheel. There is also a custom solution on Mike Patey's Scrappy bush plane, and I really try to rebuild also this suspension as close with all the details to the full-scale version. This is it about today's video. Thanks a lot for watching. I hope you liked the video. Have a good time. Happy flying. Bye bye.